Okay, welcome everybody. We have a new show for everybody. It is called Vintage, Talking Vikings History. And we will start you off. Our first show is going to be starting with how the franchise started, little tidbits about how they became a team, how they were supposed to be part of another league, but they ended up not being part of that league. Uh, the first owners' meetings, we got a couple of pictures of that. So let's go ahead and we will get right on into it right after this.
Skol Vikings, let's win this game. Skol Vikings, honor your name. Go get that first down, then get a touchdown. Rock 'em, sock 'em, fight, 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 fight. Go Vikings, run out the score. You'll hear us yell for more. Vikings, Skol Vikings, let's go.
Yeah.
That grows on you after a while, doesn't it?
Well, that's my type of music anyway. So
Yep.
But so let's. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start how they became a franchise, how they picked their colors, uh, what was the reason why they had the owners that they had when they first started? Do you want to talk about their stadium, or do you want to talk about how they became the Vikings?
I
You know
get.
what? Let's start there. Let's talk about the concept and how they became the Vikings. Let's start there before they became a franchise. Let's talk about the concept and how they became a franchise.
Well, I want to say Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis, was in the running for a NFL team, but I think there was kind of the chance that they could get an established team. Um, Minnesota as a state hadn't had an NFL team since the Duluth Eskimos left Duluth in, I believe, the 1930s. So we didn't have an NFL team. We had pro teams. We had the Minneapolis Lakers basketball team, but Max Winter sold them to LA, and Max Winter decided to get into the game of football. Well, there was already talk of a new league starting, which was the AFL. Um, in 1959, I believe it was either 58 or 59, the Chicago Cardinals played a game at Met Stadium. I forget who it was, but I think they were trying to get a feel as to how the NFL would be perceived in Minneapolis, because the Minneapolis market was growing; it was becoming a major market. And it was still the Bidwill family that owned the Cardinals, and they eventually moved to St. Louis. I believe it was 60. I think 59 was their last year in Chicago. So Max Winter, who was a like an entertainment booker slash businessman in Minneapolis, very prominent, put together a group to own a AFL team. They were going to be in the AFL, the city of Minneapolis. The the owners of that group were Max Winter, H.P. Skoglund, E. William Boyer, who was a car dealer, and Bernard Ritter, who owned the St. Paul Pioneer Press, I believe. Skoglund, I believe, was a lawyer or something of that nature. So they were the group that was going to own the Minneapolis franchise, and they had applied to get into the AFL. They were all but guaranteed a spot in the AFL. Now, when the AFL had their first meeting ever to get the league formally started and everything in 1960, they had their meeting in downtown Minneapolis. The NFL was aware of this new league starting, especially George Halas of the Chicago Bears. And this is, we didn't have a team, so most people were either Packer fans or Bear fans. This is the region. So with a rival league coming into Minneapolis, the NFL had just signed that new TV deal with, I believe, it was CBS, and the AFL had signed their deal with NBC. But George Hallis, the businessman that he was, did not want to have a AFL franchise cut into eyes for the NFL and cut into the revenue that could go to the NFL, but take away some exposure from the Packers and his team, the Bears, especially with the team so close. So the NFL had decided to expand into the South, starting with Dallas in 1960. I don't know. I Pete Rozelle was voted in as commissioner in 1960. I forget the day, but George Hallis took it upon himself to come and talk to Max Winter and talk Max Winter into telling him, listen, if you give up your rights to an AFL franchise, you will be granted an NFL franchise to start in 1961. As long as the city of Minneapolis gives up their rights to an AFL franchise. It was an upstart league. So, Max had to think, do I want to go with the upstart league or do I want to go with the established league? So Max, the businessman that he was, chose the established league and he agreed to it. So, with that being said, the owners of the Minneapolis team, and actually the city of Minneapolis, sold their rights to an AFL franchise to the city of Oakland. And that franchise became the Oakland Raiders. Now, I'm not even going to say the Vikings because they weren't the Vikings yet. The Minneapolis franchise was set to be in the NFL, but there was one thing. The group that owned the Minneapolis franchise had to let in Ole Hogsrud, who was a Duluth businessman, but
Who
also
owned the Eskimos?
he owned the Eskimos because Ole was promised years earlier by George Hallis that should another NFL team ever come to the state of Minnesota or Duluth or wherever, just the state of Minnesota, I believe, he would get ownership in that team. So instead of having 4 owners, the team had 5 owners. I was never really sure how Max felt about that. Max was kind of a staunch businessman, put it that way. And
They usually are.
yeah, well they brought Ole in, so they had the group of owners, and they were voted in January 28th, 1960 into the NFL by the other NFL owners to start in the 61 season. Here's the thing, though. The owners had to take 2 votes. One to let them in. The other was so that the team would not be called Minneapolis, but Minnesota, because at the time, none of the teams, every team had a city name.
Yeah.
And we were the first to use the whole state, and that passed. And so you had your Minnesota NFL franchise granted, I believe, January 28th, 1960.
I believe this is the picture from that owners meeting.
Yep, that's the AFL picture. That is in
Yeah, because there's Lamar Hunt. So
yep, that is downtown Minneapolis, because the AFL had their first meeting in downtown Minneapolis.
Just think, guys, they could have been an AFL franchise instead of an NFL franchise.
Yeah, a lot of people are like, because we sold the AFL rights to Oakland, and look what happened to Oakland. So, but people are kind of like, well, what if Oakland was here? And I'm like, well, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee.
Yeah.
We don't even know if they were going to be called. It was the city of Minneapolis. They could have been called anything. And by the way, I saw this earlier and I knew this. Minneapolis also had an NFL team in the 20s and 30s that never get mentioned. They were the Minneapolis Marines.
Yeah.
and nobody ever mentions them. So, Duluth wasn't the only team that had an NFL team. Minneapolis did have an NFL team.
And then, so do you know how they got their colors? Who decided on the colors? Um,
I think it
I
was
do know the
just
Vikings name came from the Norwegian heritage that's in this area.
right.
So I know that's where they came with the name of the Vikings.
Yeah,
Um,
the Viking name is from all the Norwegian heritage, the Norwegian ancestry that's up here, which is very prominent, very prominent. So, and it fit Minnesota Vikings. Um, the colors and everything, I'm not sure about. I
I
think
know
that,
colors. I know purple is considered the color of royalty.
right,
So
right, and um, it was I think it was a newspaper article, a newspaper
yeah,
cartoonist that did it. I forget his name, but he came up with the design of the Viking Norsemen, and I think the uniforms. I think the helmet with the horn, which was original, the horn on each
which
side of the helmet,
by
which
the way, people want to know how someone from Florida is a Vikings fan. Well, there's your answer. The helmets. I was
hmm
5 years old. My dad was watching the game, and I just thought those helmets were the coolest helmets I've ever seen in my life. So I've been cursed as a Vikings fan since. And
yeah.
I guess
Welcome,
you could say, you know,
welcome to our misery. But yeah, that's probably the original logo there, um, the
yeah.
horns. And if they ever get rid of that, I'll be mad. But that was,
Well, they talked about it at one time. They were going to go to the Norse head
yeah,
as the logo on the helmet as opposed to the horn. I'm like, no, just keep the horn.
yeah.
It's
Just keep,
iconic.
don't ruin history. You did that once with the jerseys you had in the 2000s with Childress. Don't do that again.
I like the
Um,
ones they have now, but
you know what? They need to go back to the originals. Go
not
back
as
to the
much as I
ones that were.
like, the Foreman era.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
I got the Gary Larson on, so you know, as long it's. I would like to see them go back to what they wore week one. Those were the original uniforms, the gray face mask, the bigger horns. I would love to see them go back to that.
yeah.
Um, so they just have to design the road uniform, but yeah, that was pretty much. And of course, once again, we didn't start until '61.
Yeah.
So
There was a so it was the Cowboys in '60, then it was us in '61, and I think somebody else in '62, right?
no, the what happened was there was the Cowboys in '60, us in '61. The next expansion wasn't until Atlanta in '66,
'66. That's what I was thinking. I was thinking
and
of the
then
Falcons. Yeah.
we New Orleans came in '67. So that was it for the expansion, and then of course the AFL brought in. I believe they changed the Titans to the Jets. They changed Boston stayed Boston until the '70s, and then they brought in Cincinnati in '68, which was Paul Brown, the old Cleveland Browns coach. That's his team,
Yeah.
and they brought in the Dolphins in '66. So yeah, so it and like we said, the reason Max came to Minnesota was with the new TV deal, and TV was starting to become a big thing. He didn't want that rival league cutting into airtime from the established leagues. There was money involved. So
So in their first year, '61, uh, I tried to find a picture. Really couldn't find a good one. Uh, the Vikings have ever only had the number one pick twice. Tommy Mason and Ron Yeri. Mason was their very first Vikings ever draft pick. Um, he was a running back, for those who don't know. Um, what are your thoughts on Mason? Was he worth the first pick?
well, and at the time in that era of football, your running backs were actually more important than your quarterbacks because it was a running game. So the first they wanted a running back. So Tommy Mason, who by the way, the AFL and NFL had separate drafts. They didn't draft together until I think later on, like '65 or '66. They started drafting together. and I forget who drafted. I forget who drafted Tommy Mason, but yes, we drafted Tommy Mason #1. We drafted Rip Hawkins, a middle linebacker, #2, and we drafted Francis Tarkington #3. Those
Yep,
were our
third
first 3 draft choices.
third
Yes.
round pick, Francis
Yep.
Tarkington. Most
And
people think
yes,
he was a first round pick, but yeah.
and yes, Davey Mason was always injured. He was
I
hurt
heard
a lot.
yeah. I heard this about the colors too, about the University of Washington.
Yep, I heard that too.
Even though they're not exactly the same as the University of Washington purple, but it's pretty close.
Yep, I heard that also.
You know.
I heard that also.
So then, yep, this going back to what Davey was saying. Yeah, Mason was, and he was. Well, a lot of running backs were injured back then too.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Mason, and he hurt his knee, and you didn't have the knee surgeries like you do now.
yeah,
So you got a knee injury back then, you were done. Which when Mason got hurt, that gave way to Dave Osborne in '65.
yeah. It also ruined Sayers' career
Yep,
with
yep,
the injury. So,
yep. And
so let's.
when we put this team together, we had a bunch of cast offs and stuff. We got Paul Dixon from Cleveland. We got Grady Alderman from Detroit. We also got Hugh McElhaney.
Yes, a lot of people don't know he played for the Vikings.
He played 2 years with the Minnesota Vikings.
If you guys don't know who he is, look him up. He was an awesome running back,
yes,
receiver, running back. He was kind of a multifaceted kind of guy.
Best years are with the Niners.
Yep.
His best years are with the Niners. And so as far as coaching went, well, first the ownership got a GM. It was Burt Rose. He was the team's first general manager. Now, when it came to coaches, very interesting choice that they had. The first 2, and this was Max Winter all the way. Their first choice to be head coach of the Minnesota Vikings was Bud Grant.
But he's like, nah, I'll stay in the Canadian Football League.
He was winning championships, and he had success in Canada, so he stayed in Canada. The other choice was Ara Parseghian, who was the head coach at Notre Dame.
Yep.
But once again, he was also having success.
Yeah.
So the selection, the third selection, was the guy they hired, Norm Van Brocklin, who had just won an NFL championship in 1960. He beat Lombardi's Packers.
Yeah.
And he's the only one to beat Lombardi's Packers in postseason.
And nobody really liked him.
No, and he was. I mean, you talk about rough around the edges. He was beyond rough around the edges.
He was the NFL's version of Woody Hayes.
Yes. Yeah, all those stories you heard about Jim Klobuchar, the Minneapolis sports writer, he told a story about how he got in a fight with Van Brocklin in the hotel room after a game. He got in a fist fight with them. He was hard on the players. What he did today would have been, players would have lost their mind. They would have lost their mind. But he was their first head coach. So they have their training camp in Bemidji, I believe.
Yeah, what was it? They had their training camp until what, 60? Until
60, 65, 66. Then they went to Mankato, but I believe they were in Bemidji.
Yeah. Which is what, and then they built Winter Park.
Right, which they didn't even.
Yeah.
They didn't even have training camp at Winter Park. They stayed in Mankato until like 2017. Once they built TCO, they moved everything there.
Yeah.
But they were in Lake Bemidji, and they were just a bunch of nobodies. They had their starting quarterback was George Shaw.
Yeah.
He was going to be the starting quarterback, so Tarkenton was already on the bench. They didn't win any preseason games, none. So they went 0-5, and they get ready to play the Chicago Bears, George Halas's team, the first game ever that counts at Met Stadium. And the week before the game, they picked up a defensive end from Cleveland by the name of Jim Marshall, who would continue to be on that team until 1979 and never miss a game. So they go to play their first game. It's against the Chicago Bears. George Shaw starts at quarterback, but he is replaced by Fran Tarkenton, and it was knee jerk. The offense wasn't moving, so Van Brocklin pulled him and put Tarkenton in. And Tarkenton moves the team, and Tarkenton's legacy begins. He does that whole scrambling thing, which drives Hallis and Van Brocklin up a wall. But he does enough. We get our first touchdown, and it was a pass from Tarkenton to tight end Bob Schnelker. And if you are a Viking fan, you know who Bob Schnelker is. He was with the team later in years as the offensive coordinator under Jerry Burns. Bob Schnelker caught the first TD pass. And the Vikings rolled that first game 37-13 over the Bears.
Yeah, it was. But they only won 2 more games the rest of the year.
Right. Well, and like a note on that Chicago Bears game, Mike Ditka played in that game. And he would say years later when they asked him about it, he's like, yeah, I remember it. I was going to quit after that game. And then they asked him, well, how did what was George Hallis's, because basically George Hallis created this monster by having this Minnesota franchise into the NFL. You were their first victim, and they beat you pretty sound. And Ditka said he didn't talk. He didn't talk on a bus. He just yelled at us for the rest of the week after the game. But yeah, that's how ticked off he was. He didn't even talk to the team on the ride home.
Yeah, so the other 2 wins that first year were Baltimore and the Rams.
Yep.
They were all at home. So they didn't win any. They didn't win any on the road that year.
No, they didn't. Matter of fact, they
Yeah.
kind of got their rear ends handed to them a lot.
So yeah, it was. Looks like it was the second half game. The first game was Vikings. They scored 37 points, but they only had 10 at half.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like they. Yeah, it says George Shaw started the game, but was soon replaced by Fran Tarkenton, who threw the 4 touchdown passes and ran for another.
Yep.
They were the first expansion team to win their inaugural games before the Texans did in 2002.
Yep.
So,
and that was just, as you say, humble beginnings. But a lot of, as years went on, a lot of the guys that played under Van Brocklin, and Van Brocklin drove them up a wall. They later played for Bud Grant and loved Bud. They loved him because Bud was just a breath of fresh air. Jim Marshall was one of Bud's favorite players of all time. That's why he was captain for so many years, Captain Jim.
Yeah. So another thing, since the Vikings have left here, they have not been to Super Bowl. I don't know if what that means. Have they become soft? Is it luck? But this was when the Vikings were dominant. Was it when they played in this old, beautiful, ugly, crappy stadium?
And it was truly a baseball stadium. For football, it was just garbage. It was garbage. You couldn't really see if the wind was blowing in the right direction, everybody froze. But the Viking team used that to their advantage, especially with warmer climate teams coming into the stadium. But it was made. Met Stadium was made for baseball.
So, yeah, when you go back to that, real quick, it's going to cover us. But when you look at that, we talked about this before we came on.
Mm-hmm.
People who don't know, both teams were on the same sideline, so you can see that both teams in the distance are on the same sideline.
Yep, both teams are on
But
the same
all that
sideline.
space on the other side, and you were saying that the visitors' locker room was also on the other side.
Yeah,
So,
the
so
visitors
Mike,
lot the
but you said they
visitors
never answered the reason why they had put the teams on one side.
no, they never did. They never did. But at that time, the Vikings weren't the only one. When Green Bay, people don't know this. Green Bay played at two stadiums at one time:
Yeah, they
Lambeau
were still.
Field
Yep.
and Milwaukee County Stadium. When they played in Milwaukee County Stadium, which was kind of modeled like Metropolitan Stadium, both teams were on that sideline.
Yeah, the Packers were so bad at some time that they couldn't sell out. People don't. Packer fans don't want to hear this. That waiting list of owners, they were so bad in the the mid '70s to the '90s. They had to play home games in Milwaukee just to have fans come to the game.
Yeah, they couldn't sell out Lambeau Field.
Yeah, they couldn't even sell at Lambeau Field. So
Nope, nope they could
yeah,
not.
we had to take a Packer day. Is what we have to do.
Mhm.
So so after that season, the Vikings obviously that was one of the worst seasons. The Vikings don't go very. The Vikings are not very bad very often.
Right.
Uh, they only had 3 wins that season. I think they've only had 3 wins, I want to say 3 or 4 times in their whole franchise history.
Yeah.
Um,
61, 84, 2011.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
And then they when the Vikings are bad, they're never bad enough. And history has shown that people are worried about them getting a new quarterback and sucking for a while. Well, the Vikings have proven that they don't that they can't be bad for a while. I think they're the only franchise I believe um, that has never had 3 losing seasons like in a row.
Yeah, they are. And the only and well, since their
And
inception,
I don't mean like above 500. I mean like 8-8 or 7-7. That all counts for
right?
you know.
But they were 3-11 in 61, 2-11-1 62, 5-8-1 in 63,
Yeah,
and then 64 they turned it around to 8-5-1. 62 they signed Mick Tingelhoff, and he would be playing
undrafted
center.
free agent. He was
Undrafted free agent Mick Tingelhoff.
Tingelhoff was the first of the great Vikings undrafted free agents that this Vikings seem to always have.
Right. And so we got Tingelhoff, and I believe we got Bill Brown also, the running back in 62. Bill was originally drafted by, I think he played for the Bears. He was a Bear, and then he came to Minnesota. And I believe we got him in 62. But once again, we were 2-11-1. And oh, by the way, Van Brocken's act was wearing thin with the players even then. 63 rolls around and they end up 5-8-1. They got Fred Cox. He became a Viking that year.
Who, fun fact, people may not know this. Fred Cox, he invented what?
The Nerf football.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, he was until his passing. He was getting royalties for the
Yep.
Nerf football. Yep.
So people, I'm surprised. Yeah, why isn't Zoe in here? I thought for sure he'd be here.
It's history. He's not interested.
I'm glad to have all y'all in here. Dave, Justin, Davy Chains, Scold Soup, Scolden. Can't appreciate y'all enough for being here for our first show. We really appreciate it. And we do this because we love the Vikings. We love Vikings history, and people need to know the Vikings history. There's a lot of fans out there. One of them is a Viking creator on our channel who think '98 is when the Vikings history started. It goes back way farther than that. So we just thought we don't think there's a show like this on YouTube, so we decided to do one because there's nothing better than Vikings history. It needs to be out there. So We appreciate y'all for being here.
Yes, he was, Davy Chains. He was. He was drafted by the Browns to back up Jim Brown because he played running back at the University of Pittsburgh. Yep, that's true.
Yeah,
And
he wasn't getting on the field with Jim Brown though.
no, and another thing with Fred Cox was he was a free agent in '62. He came to the Vikings. We had a kicker named Mike Mercer who wasn't the best. Well, they brought in Fred to give him some competition. Fred was just strictly a kicker then. And Fred did well, but Van Brocklin chose to let him go and keep Mercer. And he brought Fred back in '63.
Because he realized his mistake.
He realized,
He was the soccer style kicker didn't come until what, late 70s?
No, the first one, I believe, Pete Gogolak and I want to say he was a Giant. There was Gogolak, there was Garo Yapremian, who was with the Lions.
Lions, but he's more famously with the Dolphins.
With the Dolphins. We remember him with
Yeah.
the Dolphins, but he started out as a Lion.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, his first game, he kicked 6 field goals against the Vikings and won. And Jan was with the Chiefs.
Yeah.
But I believe the first one was it was Pete Gogolak.
Yeah, because Fred Cox was straight on.
Yep.
Right.
All the kickers were straight on. Yep.
Was Mosley straight on or was Mosley soccer?
Mosley was the last one that was straight on.
Okay.
Yeah, Mosley was the last one. He was the last one, and with the Vikings, they had straight on kickers all the way up until Benny Ricardo in 1983. And from then we've had straight on, but the last straight on kicker we had was Rick Danmeyer. So,
yeah, it's Vikings history, man. I love it. So it's our first show. I think we're going to work some kinks out. The show will get better. We'll have more presentation, production value. I really enjoyed it. Chat. We are going to talk more next week. Probably talk more about the Purple People Eaters. We'll talk about the Forgotten Man, who's, by the way, Tony is wearing the Forgotten Man's jersey. No one talks about Gary Larson. They only talk about the big three. So we'll definitely be focusing probably more on the Purple People Eaters next week. Is there anything that you guys in the chat want to hear about that we have not discussed about the inaugural season this year?
I'm trying to think of some things. I know we got Jim Marshall in '61, and Paul Dixon was also Viking. Paul Dixon was a swingman for the Purple People Eaters. That much he was actually a starter at one time. '63, we added Carl Kasulki, who was a mainstay on that defense for years. We've got Mick Tingelhoff. We drafted a Wisconsin quarterback, Ron Vanderkellen, who never really played that well with the Vikings. He was from Wisconsin, but we also had Bob Berry as a backup too. Bob had 2 stints with the Vikings. He had 2 stints. Paul Flatley was our top receiver. Paul Flatley and Jerry Reichow. Jerry Reichow later became a player personnel director with the Vikings. He was there for years. Paul Flatley, I believe, was Rookie of the Year in 1963 as a wide receiver. We had the running backfield at first of Tommy Mason and Hugh McElhaney. Then Hugh McElhaney gave way to Bill Brown. So it was Tarkington, Mason, and Brown in the backfield. And I believe they all played in the NFL Pro Bowl at one together. So we had the nucleus of players that were going to become part of those Super Bowl teams, and they had already been in the league 8 or 9 years when we went to our first Super Bowl. Some of those guys.
Well, here's a question for you. Does anybody know what happened at Howard Wood Field? It's where the Vikings played their first ever game preseason. It's the first and only ever game professional football game played, NFL game played in South Dakota. I mean, how many people know that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, Sioux Falls. It's the only time they ever had an NFL team play there.
Yep.
And I don't know if that was because of the baseball team, the stadium wasn't ready because um, stadium wasn't ready then, or what? Because the Twins didn't come till '61.
Twins came in 61. Yeah.
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 So maybe the field wasn't ready for the Twins.
Well, and
Uh,
Minnesota got their pro teams. They got the Twins in they got the Twins in 61, the Vikings in 61. They got the North Stars in 67.
yeah.
And so we had an ABA team, the Minnesota Muskies. I think they lasted maybe a season. But yeah, both the Twins and the Vikings, and they did share the stadium, which most teams did back then. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this. The Yankees shared Yankee Stadium with the New York Giants.
Yeah.
A lot of people, forget about that. The Jets shared Shea Stadium with the Mets. The most unique one was the St. Louis Cardinals, because both the St. Louis Cardinals football and the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team played at Busch Stadium.
Yeah.
That was
I
probably the
bet
most.
that was confusing. Who's playing today? The Cardinals.
Yeah. Which sport?
Yeah. So it was August 5th, 1961, when the Vikings played their preseason game in Sioux Falls.
That was a game against the Dallas Cowboys, right?
Yes.
Okay. Which they lost.
Well, yeah, they didn't win a preseason game.
Yeah, they didn't win a preseason game, but yeah, they played in Sioux Falls. A lot of times the Vikings did play a lot of preseason games in cities that were looking to have an NFL team. Like years late, they would play especially down south. I think they played in Memphis. Yeah. They played in parts of Georgia. I forget what cities, but yeah, they played in Memphis quite a bit, and parts of Florida. So,
yeah, they. I guess it wasn't planned very. So basically, the guys who organized the very first game didn't know what the hell they were doing.
Mm-mm.
So they actually lost money having the game in South Dakota.
Yeah, they did. Well, football also wasn't the draw. The national sport was baseball.
Yeah,
it was still Major League Baseball. Football was still trying to find its footing. TV helped a lot with that, and once get eyes on the product. The 60s was because you had the rival leagues. It was kind of a good time for football. It really was.
Oh yeah, well, is it the violence of football that makes it the favorite in America today? I don't know.
And also for the Vikings, I got to bring this up too. As far as football in Minnesota went, the top football team in the state was the Golden Gophers.
Oh yeah, they were coming off all them championships.
They were coming, and
they were the last. Here's a fact that people do not know about college football: the last team to win 3 straight national championships in college football was the Golden Gophers.
Golden Gophers, yep. And they had just come off a national championship in 1960.
Yeah.
So they were the kings of football up here for years till the Vikings started to dominate the way they did. But this was Gopher territory, and the Gophers had some guys that would become Vikings later on. Carl Eller, yeah, Bobby Bell was drafted by the Vikings, but he chose to play with the Chiefs.
But that was the whole. Yeah, that was like the whole AFL NFL thing.
Yeah. He was drafted. He was drafted by the Vikings. Carl Eller was drafted by Denver or Buffalo in the AFL. Um, I do know that Bobby tried to get him to play in that league, but he came to the Vikings. So
So you said, so Carl Eller was drafted by the Bills in the AFL,
yeah, okay.
but he chose the
He
Vikings.
chose like, oh, Jack
Yeah.
Snow. Okay, Jack Snow. We drafted in '65. Never played it down with the team. He got traded to the Rams. In return, we got Hal Betzel, the wide receiver, and Gary Larson, who was a swing man with the fearsome foursome. Now we got him in '65. We got Eller in '64.
Yep.
So, and also another person that played at the U with Carl Eller was his teammate. Matter of fact, they were on offense together because Carl played both ways. Milt Sunday.
Milt. Oh man.
Milt Sunday, and
He's one of the most underrated Vikings ever.
Yep, and he became a Viking. The offensive line looked pretty good. They had some guys that they were starting to build a pretty good offensive line, which you had to because you had Tarkenton as your quarterback. But Tarkenton was the type to not take a sack. He was going to extend the play if he had to, and that I give Tark credit for that. I mean, Deacon Jones even said that they hated playing Fran Tarkenton. You know, they didn't
Well,
want.
I know a lot of people are mad at Van Brocklin because they think he's the one to blame for Tarkington leaving, but he's not the reason Tarkington. I mean, he's part of the reason.
He's
Tarkington
part of
left,
the
but
reason.
he's not the main reason why Tarkington.
No, he's part of the reason Tarkington left. Part of the reason Tarkington left was his ego. He was a cocky, little, arrogant guy. SOB.
Still is.
He still is.
Still is.
What he figured, and the only other team that wanted him, I guess, was the Giants. He figured that he could go to New York, help that team win, but mostly take eyes off of Joe Namath and the Jets. Because when Bud was hired in '67, Fran was still quarterback. And Bud wanted to keep him, but Fran had it in his mind that he was going to go to New York. So,
there's a name I haven't heard in a while.
Oh, Jim Valone, yeah. Well, he rest his soul. He passed away in '77. He had Hodgkin's disease. He was a starter, and he played next to at that time Doug Davis, then Ron Yeary. I think no, he played next to Grady Alderman. I take that back. He played next to Grady Alderman.
I mean, just think about the state of the Vikings' offensive line now, and look back at their history, and you just wind up shaking your head. Same thing with the defensive line. It's the Vikings have always been known. That is like you have teams that have always been known for great quarterbacking. You know, like the Packers, or or like the Steelers. The Vikings have always been known for a nasty defensive line.
Fran even said it. When you think of the Minnesota Vikings, you don't think of Fran. You don't think of Chuck or Randy or whatever. Yeah. You think of the trenches.
Yeah.
Because that's where it all started with this team. From Alderman to Tingelhoff to Yeary to White. And then on the other side, Eller, Page, Larson, Marshall, Sutherland. And then you still had Millard and Thomas and Dolman. And then you had Randall. And then you went from Randall to Kevin Williams and Pat Williams, Jared Allen.
Yeah.
I mean, even on offense, you had Randall McDaniel, Gary Zimmerman, you had Tim Irwin, you had Jeff Christie, Todd Stussy, you had
Kurt Loudermilk.
You had Bryant McKinney, you had Steve Hutchinson, you had Matt Burke. And to look at what's happened to the Lions now is what this team is doing. It's just like it's sad. it's just sad.
Yeah, they wouldn't have had to sign Reisner.
Oh my God, Dave, Bookie Bolin. Oh,
Well, that's got
Bookie.
to be, other than Bubby Brister, that's got to be a name for the Vikings. That
Bookie was on the '69 team. He was on the '69 team. Um, yeah,
I don't think I've heard that before. That's
yeah, I've
for
heard.
me that's weird because I usually gravitate to people who have weird names.
Yeah, Bookie
You know,
Bolin. Yeah, he had a weird name. He was with us in '69. He was a backup offensive lineman. I think he played guard. I think he was a guard.
I mean, yeah, I mean, and the Vikings have had good running backs too in their history. I mean,
Oh yeah,
starting
we
off, with Mason, and I mean, Hugh McAnally wasn't their draft pick, but he did play for them. And
right.
Bobby Brown, and then Foreman. You know,
Mm-hmm. Well,
um,
I mean, growing up when I first became a Viking fan, the running backs were Dave Osborne and Bill Brown, but
yeah.
they slowly got
Osborne
replaced.
won 41, right?
Osborne wore 41, Bill
Okay.
wore 30, but they also had Clint Jones who wore 26. He was more of a kick returner. And they also had Oscar Reed, who could play halfback and fullback. He wore number 32. And then in '72, they drafted Officer Joe Coffey, also known as Ed Marinero. That was in '72.
Hit the like and subscribe button, please. Appreciate it.
Please
Really
do.
really
Please
helps out
do.
the channel.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this is awesome. I mean, I've been looking for a Vikings. I mean, you have those shows on YouTube where it's like a 15, 20 minute. Oh, talk about whole history in general. But with this show, we can actually break down. We can either go by decade, we can go by year, we can go by team. We could talk about purple people leaders next show. Next show could be about the '98 team or the '09 team.
Yeah.
Or the drafts that we've had, or it's just you can't suffer in the present and not without knowing the suffering in the past,
Right.
or the good times in the past.
Right.
You know, so
You kind of got to understand like why us older fans are so passionate about the team.
yeah,
Goes back to the history and what we see currently. I mean, what we compare it to is what we saw then. We
Yeah.
saw the 4 Super Bowls. We saw them win
well,
championships.
I didn't, but you might have.
It's
I was only alive for the last one.
yeah,
So,
it's I tell people, okay, you get to the Super Bowl and lose, you ain't got nothing left.
yeah. And people
Oh,
like,
Davy Chains, by the way,
yeah, you're more than welcome to come on anytime.
yeah, he brings up a good point about Bookie Bolin. Not only was Bookie starting that game, the starting quarterback for the Vikings was Gary Quazzo that game. Joe Cap did not start the season in '69.
I can never say that man's name.
Joe Cap did not start the season in '69. It was Gary Quazzo. And they lost by a point.
Wasn't Quazzo was a journeyman, right? Was that before or after he left Minnesota?
What happened was he was with the Colts. He was a backup to Johnny Unitas. Matter of fact, his best game as a Colt came against the Vikings in '65. He threw 5 TD passes. And at the time, general manager Jim Finks, who we will talk about also, remembered that. So, and honestly, the Vikings weren't enamored with Joe Cap. They really weren't, because he was the way he threw, and he was hurt a lot, and he wasn't the best passer. Quazzo was a better passer. So they traded, and Quazzo was in New Orleans. They traded with New Orleans to get Quazzo up here. And yeah, Quazzo ended up starting a few games with the Vikings. They just, because the team wasn't enamored with Joe. Joe was a hell of a leader. He just could not throw.
Yeah, Davey, my wheelhouse, yeah, for TV and you guys, it's probably the '60s and '70s. My wheelhouse is like from '87 to like '98.
Yep.
So we'll get into that. Tony's leading us off on this one because this is the inaugural season. So and I wasn't in Minnesota, so I'm missing a lot of the tidbits and being in touch with the people who actually played, people who were around Minnesota. I was from a distance, so having someone who was there for at least not for the first couple of years, but I mean you're not that old, but but that's so first the shows taking place in the 60s and 70s. That'll kind of be TV. Then for the 80s and 90s, that'll be more my realm. And of course, we'll both go back and forth. But I know some about the 60s and 70s, but nowhere near. This man's forgotten more about the 60s and 70s than I'll ever know. So.
And the reason Quazzo ended up with the Cardinals was because then Vikings defense coordinator Bob Holloway, who helped put together the Purple People Eaters, he took the head coaching job in St. Louis with the Cardinals. And so a bunch of ex-Vikings ended up with the Cardinals. He took the job in 71. Quazzo ended up there in 72. There were some other Vikings ended up there too. I know Dale Hackbart went, Mike McGill went, Jim Hargrove went. They were all defensive guys. Paul Dixon went too, but I want to say Dixon retired or became a player coach. They even took Leo Hayden, who, if anybody knows anything about Viking draft choices, we drafted Leo Hayden out of Ohio State in 1971. The Packers drafted his running mate, John Brockington. So you know who got the better of that deal. Brockington was the better back. Hayden never carried the ball with the Vikings, but he ended up with the Cardinals. And I don't think he played much in the NFL after that.
Well, that's why the NFL stands for not for long. Not too many people get to play it very long. Even
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
They weren't. But they didn't make the money back then. They all had to. That's back then. Training camp was actually a training camp to get the people. That's why they played so many preseason games. It was actually a training camp to get them back into shape because they worked 9 to 5 jobs in the off season because they didn't make the money they make now.
They didn't make the money. They even had to. I mean, the Vikings used to put out letters to the business community and to the working world to hire players. Give them jobs because they needed jobs. They used to put that out there.
Justin, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, man. You are welcome anytime you want, man. I appreciate you.
Oh, anytime. Anytime. Anytime.
So sorry about that.
No problem. No.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I remember watching the stories of they're like yeah, they would how the coaches would be mad that some of them were so far out of shape that 5 weeks wasn't enough.
5 weeks wasn't enough. They come in 20, 30 pounds overweight. Yeah. They couldn't lose it.
Yeah,
they couldn't lose it.
One of them, they didn't have the nutrition and stuff they have nowadays.
No,
there's cheeseburgers, fries, and all that type of stuff back
then. This is how the change from Norm Van Brocklin to Bud was. The players were sort of like, what the hell is Bud doing? Because you knew what you were going to get with Norm Van Brocklin. He was a screamer. He got on you. He was uptight. He just was all over the place. So then 67, they get Bud. Now, remember, these players are used to Van Brocklin storming around, yelling and screaming and calling people names. They get Bud, and Mick Tingelhoff said this. They hadn't done a whole lot in practice at all. But there's a game coming up, first preseason game. But the first thing that they do, that Bud has them do, is practice standing at attention for the national anthem. They didn't have a game. They didn't have no game plan, no nothing. The first thing they did was practice standing at attention for the national anthem. And the person he had to get the players to do that right was Carl Eller, because Carl Eller was in the reserves.
Yeah.
So Carl Eller was the one that had to get these guys, the grand formation, as they called it. That was Carl Eller, and that was like the first thing he did. And the players were just looking at him like, "What? Who the hell is this guy?" They really thought that. But one of the players that really had a disagreement with Bud when he got there was Roy Winston, the linebacker. Roy was used to Van Brocklin flying off the handle and everything. Well, Bud comes in, he's got these rules. smoking, no smoking, certain rules, stuff like that. And, they hadn't done much as far as a game plan. And Roy got fed up and walked out of practice. He literally walked out. He walked out of the locker room. He stormed out of the locker room. But those same guys that thought Bud was weird when they first met him loved him as time went on. The training camps were light. They were short. That was the best part. They were short.
Yeah.
And the players loved that. And there was no wear and tear on your body because you were going to have it in. I mean, they played hard. They practiced hard, but they weren't going to kill themselves. So.
Appreciate you, Al.
Yep.
Thank you for joining and watching. Appreciate it. So, yeah, I've heard this too.
Oh, yeah. They had some characters on those teams, but what's his name used to tell me. I used to talk to
Sarah.
Sarah's back. Sarah's back. Yep, she's back.
You guys wanna have a laugh with someone who's on fire in the comments all the time? That'd be Sarah.
Yep.
Appreciate you, Sarah.
What's his name? I used to talk to him. I used to talk to Bob Lurtzma all the time, and he used to tell me back then it was just such a different era that training camp could get monotonous. I mean, these guys would put jokes on each other, and Bud was the ringleader. The Jim Marshall would literally at the end of training camp, when training camp was over, Jim Marshall would stand in the parking lot as players are leaving. Jim would shoot off all his guns. And Chuck Foreman said Jim had like every gun known to man. We all thought he worked in the CIA in the off season.
Because he would just disappear.
He would disappear. Once the season was over, you didn't hear from Jim probably till if the season ended, and back then the seasons ended the first week of January because that's when the Super Bowl was over. And you wouldn't hear from Jim until like April.
Around draft time.
Around draft time.
Yeah.
But it was just it was a different time. And the stories they told me, I mean,
it was like what, 18 rounds back then, something like that to draft.
Oh gosh, 17. They drafted Dave Winfield from the baseball player. They drafted him in the 17th round. Now keep in mind, I went to Dave's high school. My sister went to high school with Dave here, St. Paul Central. He played football at Central, but he never played football at the U. And the Vikings drafted him. They drafted him.
Talent's talent.
Yeah.
I think he made the wise decision playing baseball.
That's a smart move.
Less wear and tear on your body, more money.
Yeah, I wonder if Kyler Murray's thinking that.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's
All right, Justin. Enjoy your show.
All right, Justin. But yeah, I mean, there's so many stories just historically. It's a lot to cover. A lot.
Well, that's why we said, are we really going to be able to keep this to an hour? And I told you I don't think so.
No.
Because we're at 58 minutes right now, and it's like we're in the thick of it right now. We got more people joining.
Yeah, we'll always have a topic. Put it that way. We'll always have a topic. We've got 63 years to cover, and there's been a lot that's happened with this team on and off the field in that 63 years. A lot of stories.
Yeah, a lot of stories. Now, the thing about it is when you look at it really is kind of aggravating, or I guess painful, I guess you could say. The fact that they do have a championship, which, by the way, we don't even have the trophy for.
No,
the grimy, greasy Green Bay Packers won't give it to us.
Yeah, exactly.
So we do have a championship. Even if you look at the NFL.com, it does say championship won for Minnesota. It's just not a Super Bowl.
It's not a Super Bowl.
So do we want to be like the franchise that's the most successful without winning the Super Bowl, or do people say, "Oh, do you guys want to have a history like the Bucks, or a team, or the Saints, or anything like that?" And I'm like, no. I've earned these scars being a Vikings fan, and they will win one day, and when they win that one day, Nicollet is going to be on fire. It's going to it's going to be a purple rain party like no one's ever seen before. So yeah, no, I wouldn't change our history for anything.
If put it this way, if the Vikings ever win a Super Bowl, you know how you had those obnoxious fans that would all year round remind you that their
Yeah,
team won a Super. I'd be that fan, and I would rightfully deserve to be that fan. Um, I'm going to let you know my team finally won a Super Bowl. I don't care where I am.
if I, I'm gonna, you know, I'm gonna, I'll probably get another tattoo.
Mhm. Yeah, the curse.
you know,
Yeah, it's that curse.
but is that? It's not really a Vikings curse, though, is it? It's more of a Minnesota curse.
It's a Minnesota curse that was lifted in 91, and
Well,
recently it's
87 is
87
91.
and
Yeah,
91. It was lifted, but as far as football goes, it's still
yeah.
there. Um,
Well, think about it. The push off.
the push off.
Um, it's the Bounty Gate.
Bounty Gate. Oh, and everybody forgets
Yeah,
87. I
the
think
strike year.
Anthony Carter ran the wrong route
Yeah, on the
in the
touchdown that Darren
championship.
Nelson dropped. Now,
Yes,
Darren Nelson should have still caught it, but yeah,
right. But you could go back. It probably started. It probably started with the Hail Mary pass, and that was. And we'll get into this
the push
topic
off.
later. Yeah, that
I would
was.
never call it. I would never call it that play.
Yeah, and
It was a push off.
that goes back to there was a deep kind of hatred, a rivalry with the Tom Landry and Bud Grant, big rivalry, and Tex Schramm, and that goes back to the '73 championship game.
He's the guy that came up with that dumb term America's team, isn't he?
Yeah, he's the one. Yep. He's the one. I remember, I forget who it was. It wasn't a Viking, but I think it was somebody. I think they played for Washington, but they said, I don't know how they're America's team. There's, at that time, 27 other cities that hate your guts.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Davey, it's the Ed Thorpe Trophy. Green Bay still has it. It's sitting in their trophy case right now. Yep. And they were supposed to give it to the Colts in '68.
Who were supposed to give it to us?
And the Colts were going to give it to us. I don't know, the way we beat the Colts that year, they probably
they probably
they probably wouldn't. Yeah, Shula's another one. Shula, there's two coaches.
It's funny you talk about Shula and Landry. Where I live now is cowboy country, and I grew up in Dolphin country. The two coaches that had the biggest gripes with Minnesota. I just find that funny.
Oh yeah, and I remember Super Bowl 8 vividly. That was the first Super Bowl I ever watched. And unfortunately, I watched the whole damn game of Larry Zonka just running through the Viking defense. And they ran right at my guy, Alan Page. And he complained.
Well, Alan Page was small.
He was, but Kuchenberg wasn't bigger. Kuchenberg wasn't much bigger. Kuchenberg was like
Kuchenberg was like 230, 240.
Yeah, he was
And
not
Page
that
was like
big.
Page was the wide receiver size.
Well, at that time Page was 245.
Yeah.
He was 245. He got down to like 221 when we cut him, which
tight end. Yeah, he was more of a tight end.
Right.
Okay, could you imagine playing defensive end today at 245?
Oh God, no. Well, the biggest lineman the Vikings had in the Bud Grant era during those Super Bowl years was probably Ron Yeary. But Ron Yeary was also tall. He was 6'6". But he was like 240, 245.
Well, all players back then were not as big as they are now.
No. I think the first 300 was probably Buck Buchanan, but Buck was Kansas City Chiefs defensive tackle. He was like 6'8".
Yeah,
he was 6'8". I remember Bob Young played offensive line for the St. Louis Cardinals. He was tipping 3.
And then because Bubba Smith and Ed Too Tall Jones were considered like two best players when
they were tall, but they were lanky.
Yeah.
Carl Eller was 6'6", 250.
Yeah.
Jim was I think Jim played at 240. He says he was playing at like 220 when he retired.
Yeah, but he had get off.
Oh, he had a quick off the ball. The biggest guy was Gary Larson. Gary Larson was 6'5", 255.
That's why he played the middle.
Yep.
Mostly, you know.
Yep. He was
And
he was
he was bigger than Sutherland too, wasn't he?
Yeah, Sutherland was matter of fact, Sutherland was small. Sutherland was like 6'3", 247. So
Yeah.
but I want to say Doug came into the league as a linebacker, and what's his name liked him so much. D-line coach Jack Patera. Jack Patera moved him to defensive line. So, but yeah, he was another small school guy. Big Daddy Lipscomb. Okay, yeah, Big Daddy was like 6'7", 6'8".
There's a reason why they called him Big Daddy.
Yeah, he was a big dude. He died young of a heroin overdose.
Yeah. I mean, what's his name? Rosie Greer? I think he was pretty big too.
Rosie Greer was 300 pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rosie Greer was 300 pounds. But like Merlin Olsen was.
I don't know. He was tiny
Compared to the rest.
I mean, compared to today's lineman.
Yeah, he was maybe 260.
Yeah, but he was also what? He's 6'5", I think.
6'5".
Yeah.
Yeah. He and Alan Page when he came into the league. Alan Page was pretty chunky when he came. He was like 265, 270. He also came into the league as a defensive end because he played defensive end in Notre Dame.
Yeah,
he got to the Vikings and we moved him to defensive tackle. So
yeah, he could have played either or, but
I
think they made the decision by putting him where they put him was a good.
And
the Vikings.
At that time when Bud came in, he wanted you to play his position. The only player that ever got to play other positions on that defensive line was Alan Page. I've seen film where they've got Alan Page lined up at defensive end and Jim Marshall lined up at defensive tackle. That was in 71, the year that Page became was NFL MVP. Yeah, Roger Brown was over 300 too. Yeah, I think Alex Karras was a big one too.
Just like everybody when you watch the videos from back then, Carl Eller looks so much bigger, but he was 6'6", 247.
Well, but it's also too, if you notice, like here's what you won't have with today's players compared to the players back then. You knew what position they played by how they looked in their equipment.
Yeah,
the aesthetics, as they call it. Your offensive linemen and your linemen look like linemen. The big cages, the big shoulder pads, the neck rolls, the tape, the pads. You knew it.
Yeah.
Now they all look the same. Nowadays they look like fat guys that have jerseys on that don't fit them.
I'm still. Why are you guys letting defensive linemen wear 0?
Yeah, especially the one we got wearing 0. That's another one. That's another topic for another show.
Yeah, that's another show. Not. Yeah.
Well, the NFL basically has run out of numbers.
Yeah.
So they got rid of their number system. I mean, a lot of people say, like our guy Ivan Pace should wear 0. I'm like, nah, he looks good at 40. Let him rock 40. That's a linebacker number. I mean,
0 was his college number. Maybe he doesn't want to wear 0 anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of like Mike Curtis with Baltimore wore 32.
Yeah.
And Andy Russell in Pittsburgh wore 34. We had a linebacker at one time, John Kirby, that wore number 36. And but I'm used to linebackers wearing like Wally Hilgenberg wore 58. Lonnie Warwick 59, Matt Blair 59, Fred McNeil 54, Studwell 55. I mean, that's a football name, Studwell. Jeff Seaman 50. I'm used to guys wearing 50s as a linebacker. It's just taking a while for me to get used to what this new numbering thing. That's just me, though.
But 22 is a safety number, and so I'm glad.
Definite safety number.
Yeah.
And we've had
especially with this team.
Yeah, and we've had two greats wear them.
Paul Grouse. A lot of people don't know that. Even though he's the all-time, a lot of people still don't know that he's the all-time NFL leader in interceptions.
Yep. Well, they They also don't know this.
You played for the Redskins?
No, his college days.
Okay.
He played quarterback at the University of Iowa. His head coach was Jerry Burns. And I think he played either a guard or a he might have played center. But he was also on the team with him, Wally Hilgenberg.
Oh, good old Wally.
They were all on that Iowa team. Yeah, but when Paul came to the NFL, he ended up with the Redskins, wearing number 26, as a matter of fact. And he intercepted, I think, 12 or 14 passes his rookie year. But the Redskins head coach, Otto Graham, traded him because he couldn't tackle.
Yeah.
That's why he traded him. You know.
But why do you need to tackle when you can just pick off the other team's quarterback?
Yeah, here's the thing. If you're a safety and you're making a lot of tackles, that means your front seven aren't doing their job.
Yeah.
You know, that means they're not doing their job.
So if y'all go ahead and hit up the email, we will look at the emails and we will discuss the topics and we will give you a shout out. We may even let you come on for a little bit. I know I had a blast doing this show. This is going to be a weekly thing. Same bat time, same bat channel. On TV, man, it was a pleasure, man. I can't tell you how excited I am to actually do this show. There's nothing like this, from what I know, anywhere.
So, no, there isn't. I'm looking forward to it because there's a lot to cover just with the Vikings and football in general, NFL football in general.
So we touched on the inaugural season and how they became a franchise. We talked about their first game, somewhat about their first couple years, and then we kind of meandered a little bit just to get a base of the Vikings history. Our shows in the future would be more topic-driven as far as maybe the first half hour. Then we'll probably meander more because Tony and I have seen it. If you ever watch our post-game shows, we kind of meander, but it's always about history. So we are going to, like I said, we'll take your suggestions in. We might do that. The curse that Dave brought up. We may discuss that next week. But we'll let you guys know. We'll have Yogi set it up and everything and all that because he's the graphic king. So like I said, TB, it was a pleasure, and I hope you guys enjoy the show. I hope you guys come back. It was a pleasure, and it was. See y'all next week.
Skol Vikings, let's win this game. Skol Vikings, honor the name. Go get that first down, then get a touchdown. Rock 'em, sock 'em, fight, 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 fight. Go Vikings, run out the score. You'll hear us yell for more. Vikings, Skol Vikings, let's go.